If you open the news today, you will hear a lot about some wars and almost nothing about others. We talk about Ukraine, we talk about Gaza, we talk about the Middle East and great power competition. But there is another place on this planet where, right now, hundreds of thousands of people are being starved, terrorized, and possibly killed on a scale that could define this century. And most of the world has either never heard the name of that city or has already scrolled past it. That city is called Fasher, in the region of Darfur, in Sudan. Ironically, many people first heard about Sudan recently because of a completely wrong, misleading picture. A viral post on social media showed a satellite image from Google Earth, a dark red stain on the ground, surrounded by tiny white shapes. The caption claimed this was a giant bloodstain and hundreds of bodies after a massacre in Sudan. The image was shared millions of times, appearing in posts about genocide, about ethnic cleansing, about the world's worst horror. The problem is, that image was not what people said it was. When independent analysts and open-source researchers looked closer, they noticed details that did not add up. The coordinates pointed to a small settlement called Kumia, hundreds of kilometers away from the epicenter of the current fighting. The timestamp showed that the image was from early 2024, well before the most recent offensive. And when they went back to older satellite images from 2022, before the latest phase of the war had even begun, the same dark patch and the same white dots were still there. What was this massacre site? Most likely, it was a muddy waterhole where livestock gathered to drink. The bodies were almost certainly cattle standing in the water. In other words, a tragic, bloody story built around the misunderstanding of a single image. It would be very easy to stop the conversation right there and say, "See? People exaggerated. Social media is full of lies." But that would be a terrible mistake. Because while that specific image was false, the horror it was being used to represent is very, very real. A different city, not Kumia but Fasher, has been at the center of one of the most frightening sieges of our time. And the atrocities that many experts believe have happened there over the past months might end up being remembered as one of the worst episodes of mass killing in the 21st century. To understand how we got here, we need to go step by step. Fasher is the capital of North Darfur, a region in western Sudan. Before the war, it was home to hundreds of thousands of people, many of them already displaced by previous rounds of violence. When the current conflict in Sudan broke out in April 2023 between the Sudanese armed forces, the regular army, often called the SAF, and a powerful paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, Fasher quickly became a strategic prize. The RSF is not just another militia. It is the latest incarnation of forces that have terrorized Darfur for decades. To understand what is happening in Fasher today, we have to go back to where those forces came from. Darfur sits at the edge of the Sahara, between the Arab world to the north and the black African belt to the south. Its people are overwhelmingly black, overwhelmingly Muslim, and divided into dozens of ethnic groups and tribes. Some communities historically lived as farmers, cultivating land in the slightly wetter zones. Others were more nomadic, herding camels, sheep, and cattle, moving across the semi-desert in search of pasture. On paper, labels like Arab and African sound clear and racial. On the ground in Darfur, they are more complicated. Many so-called Arab tribes are black, speak Arabic as their main language, and are traditionally herders. Many of the so-called African tribes are also black, speak non-Arabic languages, and are traditionally farmers. It is a fragile, overlapping social fabric that has existed for centuries. Then the climate began to change. From the 1970s onward, Darfur was hit by repeated droughts and advancing desertification. Rainfall dropped, crops failed. The Sahara pushed slowly south. At the same time, Sudan's population grew quickly, putting pressure on land and water. Traditional arrangements that once allowed farmers and herders to share space, planting after the rains, grazing after the harvest, became harder and harder to maintain when there simply was not enough fertile land to go around. At the national level, Sudan's political system was dominated by elites in the capital, Khartoum, many of them from riverine Arab-speaking groups in the center and north. Regions like Darfur, far away in the west, were marginalized. Fewer schools, fewer hospitals, fewer roads, less political representation. Local grievances deepened. Here you can already see the fault lines. Environmental stress, economic inequality, ethnic identity, and political exclusion, all layered on top of each other. As if that were not enough, outside powers poured gasoline on the fire. In the 1970s and 80s, Libya, under Muammar Gaddafi, tried to export a revolutionary Arab nationalist project across the Sahara. His regime armed and trained fighters from across the region, including from Darfur. Some of those fighters joined a unit sometimes called the Islamic Legion, a kind of foreign legion that fought in Chad and elsewhere. Many of these men returned to Darfur hardened by war, still carrying weapons and saturated with new ideas about Arab supremacy and ethnic struggle. Around the same time, local political networks in Darfur gave rise to groups such as the Arab Gathering, which circulated manifestos blaming so-called African tribes for holding back Arab progress. Language that had once described livelihoods and dialects became twisted into something much more racist and dangerous. Old disputes over land between neighbors were reinterpreted as part of a grand civilizational struggle. Fast forward to the early 2000s. Sudan was already embroiled in a long civil war between the north and the south. While the government in Khartoum negotiated peace with southern rebels, many people in regions like Darfur felt abandoned. Rebel movements emerged in Darfur itself, such as the Sudan Liberation Army, SLA, and the Justice and Equality Movement, JEM. They accused the government of oppression, neglect, and discrimination, and they attacked government targets to force Khartoum to pay attention. The government's response was brutal and cynical. Khartoum did not want to overstretch its regular army, already committed elsewhere. Instead, it turned to the very militias that had been growing in Darfur. Arab-dominated armed groups, often riding horses or pickup trucks, who would come to be known under a single terrifying name: Janjaweed. These militias were given weapons, training, and political protection. They were told to crush the rebellion. In practice, that meant attacking villages, especially those identified with the communities seen as sympathetic to the rebels. What followed has been described by many observers as one of the worst campaigns of mass violence in modern African history. Villages were burned to the ground. Men were executed or disappeared. Women were raped on a large scale. Entire communities were driven from their homes, forced into camps inside Darfur or over the border in Chad. Estimates vary, but hundreds of thousands of people were killed and millions were displaced. In 2004, the United States government called what happened in Darfur genocide. The United Nations later used different legal language, crimes against humanity and war crimes, but there was little doubt that something close to an attempt to destroy entire groups was underway. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Sudan's president at the time, Omar al-Bashir, accusing him of crimes against humanity and genocide. But in practice, very few people were held accountable. One notorious Janjaweed leader surrendered years later and faced trial, but most of the network remained intact, protected, and eventually integrated into the state. And this is where we arrive at the Rapid Support Forces. In 2013, the Sudanese government took many of the Janjaweed militias and reorganized them into a formal paramilitary structure called the Rapid Support Forces. On paper, the RSF became a kind of border guard or counterinsurgency force under state authority. In reality, it remained a powerful, semi-autonomous armed network led by a commander commonly known as Hemedti, and deeply rooted in the same patterns of violence that had devastated Darfur in the years before. The RSF was used not only in Darfur, but also in other parts of Sudan, and even in foreign interventions like the war in Yemen. Fighters gained battlefield experience. Its leaders gained access to new sources of money, including control of gold mines in Darfur and other economic ventures. Over time, the RSF became so powerful that it was both a tool of the state and a potential rival to it. In 2019, a popular uprising in Sudan overthrew Omar al-Bashir. Millions of people took to the streets, demanding democracy, justice, and an end to decades of authoritarian rule. It was a moment of enormous hope. But the transition that followed was fragile and full of contradictions. The Sudanese armed forces and the RSF jointly oversaw a transitional government alongside civilian leaders. The same generals who controlled the guns were now supposed to guide the country towards democracy. It did not last. By 2023, tensions between the head of the army, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the RSF leader Hemedti had become impossible to hide. Negotiations over integrating the RSF into the regular army, over who would control security and economic assets, stalled and then collapsed. In April 2023, open fighting broke out between the SAF and the RSF in the capital and across the country. From that point on, large parts of Sudan became a battlefield. Neighborhoods in Khartoum were shelled and looted. Towns across the country were caught in the crossfire. But in Darfur, the war took on an even darker character, because old ethnic wounds and old militia networks were still there, just below the surface. In 2023, reports emerged of horrific violence in the city of El Geneina in West Darfur. Summary executions, the targeting of specific ethnic communities, bodies dumped in mass graves or left in the streets, tens of thousands of people fleeing on foot to the border with Chad. Survivors described patterns of attack that sounded very much like the early 2000s all over again. Meanwhile, in North Darfur, El Fasher came under increasing pressure. The city became one of the last major urban centers in Darfur, still under some form of army-aligned or neutral control, surrounded by territory where the RSF had the upper hand. Over months, RSF forces and allied militias tightened a ring around the city, cutting off roads, threatening supply routes, and isolating hundreds of thousands of people inside. Aid agencies warned of a looming catastrophe: shortages of food, medicine, and clean water, hospitals running low on supplies, families trapped with no safe route out. Analysts compared it to a medieval siege, but with modern weapons. What made the situation even worse was that, Outside Sudan and a small circle of humanitarian organizations and researchers, few people were paying attention. The world's limited capacity for outrage seemed to have been consumed by other crises. Then came the final assault. In mid-2025, RSF fighters pushed deeper into the outskirts of Fasher. Artillery and drones were reportedly used to strike strategic points, markets, clinics, and fortified positions. Neighborhoods that had become home to displaced people from previous waves of violence once again turned into battle zones. Humanitarian groups pleaded for a ceasefire, warning that a direct RSF takeover of the city could lead to a massacre. When RSF units finally breached the last lines of defense and moved into central Fasher, communications from the city became patchy. Phone networks, already fragile, were disrupted. Internet access was limited or cut. What we know comes from a mix of eyewitness testimonies, videos posted online, and satellite imagery analyzed by independent labs and organizations. Some of those videos, too graphic and disturbing to show on mainstream platforms, appear to depict summary executions, groups of men being marched away at gunpoint, and the looting of medical facilities. Analysts caution that every clip needs to be verified, but the pattern is consistent with what we have seen in other Darfur towns taken by the RSF. Satellite images tell a similar story, without showing any individual face. Around key sites, such as hospitals and city squares, analysts have spotted unusual disturbed earth, rectangular patches that resemble mass graves. Between one satellite pass and the next, new trenches appear, then are filled in. In other cases, rows of objects that look like wrapped bodies seem to line courtyards or empty lots. Again, each finding needs careful interpretation, but taken together with testimonies from survivors who managed to escape, they paint a picture of large-scale loss of life. Some experts have gone so far as to suggest that the number of people killed in Fasher in just a short period could rival or even exceed the tolls of other, far more widely covered conflicts over a much longer time. Exact figures are difficult, maybe impossible, to obtain in the chaos of war. But the possibility alone, that tens of thousands of people could have been killed in a matter of days or weeks, should be enough to demand the world's attention. Yet most of the world has not been watching. Part of the reason is that many people simply do not know where Sudan is, or why Darfur matters, or how this conflict connects to things they do hear about every day, like global trade, foreign policy, and the price of gold. Another reason is that the story is complex. It is not a simple tale of good versus evil, or one clear aggressor and one unified victim. There are multiple armed actors, overlapping histories, and uncomfortable questions about the role of international partners and powerful states far from Africa. One of the most uncomfortable questions is this: how can a militia like the RSF, born out of local horse-mounted militias in Darfur, afford modern weapons, drones, and artillery? Where does its money come from? And what is the connection between the suffering in Fasher and the wealth of distant cities like Dubai? The answer lies in one word: gold. Sudan is one of Africa's top gold producers. Many of the richest deposits are in remote areas, including parts of Darfur. Over the past decade, control of gold mines and smuggling routes has become a pillar of power and wealth for armed actors. The RSF and its associated companies and partners have, according to multiple investigations, gained extensive control over parts of this sector. mines, processing sites, and the smuggling networks that move gold across borders. From there, the gold flows out of Sudan, often through neighboring countries like Chad or the Central African Republic, and eventually onto planes headed to the Gulf. One of the key hubs in this network is the United Arab Emirates, especially the city of Dubai, which has positioned itself as a major global center for gold trade and refining. Gold arrives in Dubai's markets and is bought, sold, mixed and refined until its origins are almost impossible to trace. It becomes jewelry, investment bars, or part of central bank reserves. For the RSF, this gold is not just a treasure, it is a lifeline. It can be traded for cash, used to pay fighters, and converted into weapons. Reports from journalists and researchers have described how weapons shipments, including drones and heavy arms, have reached the RSF through complex routes that sometimes start or pass through Gulf states. Planes that on paper might be carrying humanitarian supplies or commercial goods have been suspected of delivering military equipment. The details are often murky, hidden behind shell companies and vague cargo manifests. But the broad picture is clear. Without access to money and markets, it would be much harder for the RSF to sustain a nationwide war. This is where international politics comes in. The United Arab Emirates is an important partner for many Western countries. It buys advanced weapons from the United States and Europe. It hosts military bases that are central to operations in the Gulf and beyond. Its sovereign wealth funds invest billions of dollars around the world. It has played a visible role in diplomacy, including efforts to normalize relations between Arab states and Israel. In other words, the UAE is not some isolated, easily targeted actor. It is deeply integrated into the geopolitical and economic architecture of the modern world. That makes it hard, and politically costly, for big powers to confront it over something like its alleged role in Sudan's war. A government that is trying to maintain air bases, arms deals, diplomatic agreements, and financial ties may be reluctant to impose serious sanctions or threaten those relationships over a conflict that, sadly, many of its citizens barely know exists. So what we have is a kind of deadly triangle. At one corner, there is the RSF, an armed force with roots in past atrocities, accused of carrying out new ones, especially in Darfur. At another corner, there is the Sudanese state and its rival armed forces, either too weak or too complicit to stop the cycle of violence. And at the third corner, there are powerful foreign partners and markets benefiting from Sudan's resources, especially gold, while distancing themselves from the consequences on the ground. Meanwhile, ordinary Sudanese people are trapped in the middle. Across the country, the war has displaced millions of people. Families have been pushed out of their homes multiple times, fleeing one front line only to run into another. Schools have closed, hospitals have been bombed, looted, or left without staff and supplies. Humanitarian agencies warn that Sudan is facing one of the largest hunger crises in the world today, with tens of millions of people needing food assistance. For people in Darfur, and especially in places like Fasher, the suffering is even more concentrated. Many of them have already lived through 2 or 3 rounds of displacement, fleeing their villages in the 2000s, living in camps for years, then being forced to move again as fighting shifts. Some communities have been targeted not just because they are in the wrong place, but because of who they are, the language they speak, the tribe they belong to, the labels others put on them. When we use words like ethnic cleansing or atrocity, it can be easy to forget that what we are talking about are individual lives, with names, stories, and hopes. Children who just want to go to school and play. Parents trying to find food for their families. Elderly people who have seen their entire world burned down more than once. These are the people living under siege in cities like Fasher. So the question becomes, what can be done? And perhaps more honestly, what are we willing to do? From a policy perspective, the steps that could make a difference are not a mystery. Powerful states could put real pressure on those who supply weapons and money to armed groups in Sudan. They could impose targeted sanctions on companies involved in conflict gold and hold them accountable. They could restrict arms sales to governments or entities that are unable or unwilling to prevent their territory from being used as a transit point for weapons to militias. They could push for stronger investigations by international bodies into war crimes and crimes against humanity, including what has happened in Fasher. But all of that requires political will, and political will often follows public awareness. Right now, the story of Sudan, of Darfur, of Fasher is largely invisible in mainstream global conversation. It does not dominate front pages. It rarely trends on social media in a sustained way. When it does appear, it is often in the form of a single shocking photo or a brief headline about fighting in Sudan, without context, without history, without names. One of the reasons we are talking about this today is precisely to push back against that silence. This is not about taking sides in a simplistic way, or pretending that one armed group is pure and another is pure evil. It is about recognizing that there are patterns we have seen before: the use of paramilitaries to carry out atrocities with deniability, the targeting of specific communities, the use of hunger and siege as weapons of war, the exploitation of natural resources like gold to fuel violence, and the complicity of outside players who profit from those resources while expressing concern from a safe distance. We have seen versions of this story in different places and different eras. In the Great Lakes region of Africa, where mineral wealth helped finance devastating wars. In Latin America, where paramilitary groups were weaponized against civilian populations. In the Balkans, where sieges and ethnic cleansing shocked the conscience of the world in the 1990s. Each time, people said, never again. Yet here we are, once more watching, if we choose to look, as similar dynamics unfold. So what can you, sitting somewhere far away, actually do? First, you can refuse to let this story disappear. Learn the names: Darfur, Fasher, Rapid Support Forces, Sudanese Armed Forces. Understand the basic timeline: the genocide-level violence of the 2000s, the formation of the RSF, the revolution of 2019, the war of 2023, the siege and assault on Fasher. Share this context with others, whether that is through social media, conversations with friends, or simply refusing to change the subject when this conflict comes up. Second, you can support organizations that are trying to help, even in extremely difficult conditions. Humanitarian agencies delivering food and medical care, groups documenting human rights abuses, journalists and researchers who painstakingly verify information from the ground. They cannot stop the war by themselves, but they can save lives, preserve evidence, and push back against disinformation and denial. Third, in countries where you have political representation, you can ask your elected officials what they are doing about Sudan. Are they supporting real diplomatic efforts to pressure all sides to protect civilians and allow aid into besieged areas? Are they willing to look critically at the role of their own allies and economic partners in conflicts like this? Are they taking steps to ensure that gold and other resources linked to atrocities do not enter their markets? None of this is easy. It is much simpler to look away, to say that Sudan is too far, too complicated, too hopeless. But ignoring a fire does not put it out. It just allows it to spread. As we close this analysis, I want to return to that viral satellite image, the one that misled so many people. In a way, it is a symbol of our current information environment. We are constantly bombarded with shocking visuals, often stripped of context, sometimes completely fake. We react with outrage for a moment, we share, we comment, and then we move on. Meanwhile, the slower, more complex, more deeply rooted horrors, the ones without a single dramatic photo, continue largely in the shadows. The real worst horror on Earth that you are not being told about is not a single red patch on a satellite map. It is a system. A long history of marginalization and racism. A set of armed groups built on impunity. A network of economic interests that turn blood into gold. And a global hierarchy of attention that decides which victims are seen and which are forgotten. Fasher and the people of Darfur are at the center of that story right now. What happens to them will say a lot about who we are as an international community, and about how seriously we take our own promises of never again. If you are watching this, you are already part of a very small group of people who know more about Sudan than most. The question now is, what will you do with that knowledge? Will you let it be just another sad video that you click away from? Or will you treat it as an invitation to learn more, to speak up, to support those who are trying against all odds to protect lives in a place the world has almost chosen to forget? The people in Fasher may never know your name. They may never see this video. But the pressure you help create, the conversations you start, and the choices you make about what deserves your attention can ripple outward in ways none of us can fully predict. Silence and indifference are part of what allow atrocities to happen. Breaking that silence is the first step, however small, toward a different outcome.